When God created creation, duality was created, necessarily. And duality on an energetic level is expressed through the principles of centripetal force and centrifugal force. Centripetal force is the force of returning towards unity. Centrifugal force is spreading out. And the centrifugal force of life creates division, diversity, the more individual expression of self, rather than moving towards unity. So there's bound to exist a centrifugal force if there exists duality, and without duality there can be no creation. We can't exist if there is only unity. So the force of moving back towards God, the centripetal energy, is well thought of, is spoken of in glowing terms. It's the only direction of a good person. And I'm being facetious. This is what religions like to teach, except for earth-based religions like paganism, Wicca, Druidry. They understand that the divisive energy of dividing, of separation, of centrifugal force, the separation from God, is of equal importance in maintaining the balance between the inward and the outward movement. Now, this force of individual expression, like any force, can be expressed in a holistic way, a wholesome way, or it can be distorted. Distorted means involving tort. Tort is wrongness. The tort in contract law is when somebody does wrong. Tort. Distorted means that you're doing the wrong thing. In other words, you're not being right. You're not being authentic. Now, a distortion of the centrifugal energy of God has got a name. People like to call it by the name the devil. And it's associated with other names like the great deceiver and so on, Satan, and all of these romantic names that titillate the imagination and sell books and movies, and eventually, in the extreme form, sells religion. And so it's a very good money earner in the days of early Christians. It still is. They're still making a huge amount of money by selling the devil. And that's what it is. It's a sell. It's a promotion of an idea that makes money. There isn't any other use for the devil. The devil is just a marketing device. A very clever one. It works. And it's got all manner of forms. But I think that the name the Great Deceiver is pretty informative. It's not telling the truth. It's a distortion. It's false. So whenever you're in the company of somebody who's not telling the truth, then the devil is getting its way. So we're almost certainly talking about lawyers and marketing executives and politicians, and they kind of dress up the part. The devil usually likes to wear a suit and tie in the male form, or sexy, I'll offer my body to you sort of clothes in the female form. But there's other forms, it takes the form of food substitutes that make food taste nice, even though it's not food, like lots of sugar and salt and chemicals to dress up stuff as though it were eatable, and so on. So the operation of lies and so on in this world of lies is that which we call the devil. Now, in a softer form, you could call it glamour. And each and every one of us has the facility for glamour, our hoax, the presentation of self at our best. We dress ourselves up, gloss ourselves up. And when we're selling a second-hand car, do we take it to the car wash before we sell it or not? Most people do. And if we're out for a date, do we put on our most attractive clothes? Most of us do. We glamorize ourselves to pretend that we're a little bit better than what we are. So we don't want to knock the devil too much because it's a part of who we are. In fact, it's that part of who we are that makes us very individual. It's the individuation, well, not in the Jungian term, but it's the individual expression of the difference between me and you. Now, if we start looking at it in this wholesome way, we see that this card, the devil, represents that aspect of self which is happy to be ego. It may well understand itself to be soul expressing through ego. That may well be true. But here we have the accentuation of the difference between I and thou. And the study of this is really important if we are to come to terms with the difference between ego consciousness and soul consciousness. Now, in ego consciousness, we may or may not affirm the idea that we have a soul. But even if we do affirm that we have a soul, we're not affirming that we are a soul. And that's the enlightened position to be in. I am eternal. I am God conscious. I am expressing temporarily through this 70, 80 year period as an ego, as a personality. However, I am eternal. I am goodness itself. I am free. I am spirit. This is soul consciousness. So even if you're a believer and you think, yeah, I have a soul, you're kind of missing the point. You don't have a soul. The soul has you. Those of us who identify so thoroughly with the ego that we don't even acknowledge the existence of soul, let alone self-identification as soul, those of us kind of more subject to the workings within us of the devil energy, of the centrifugal force of God, of the inclination to move away from unity towards self-importance. So the card in the tarot indicates our relationship with self-importance, our way of dealing with the temptations of not only self-importance but unhealthy pleasure, whether that's too much sex or wrong foods or overclaiming the importance of self or underclaiming the importance of self. All of these things are the kind of playthings that we get up to when we identify ourselves too much with self rather than unity. It is important for us to come to terms with this energy called the devil, because if we don't, then inevitably we will deny it. It must not be denied because it will be repressed and gain a vast amount of energy by the force of repression. If we face it honestly, openly, with an open mind, then the healing begins. If we pretend it doesn't exist, if we turn away from it, if therefore we repress it and deny it, it just feeds it. That's what gives it its energy. That's what promotes the idea of self-importance. I'm not somebody who does that. I'm more important. I'm more sacred. I'm more holy than that. Well, that's good ego stuff. That'll bind you up in your ego, no problem. So what we have to do is to identify that which we are afraid of, that which we're habituated to. These are the main two, I would think. Those forces in life which aren't helpful for us in terms of health, well-being, and God consciousness. Anything that we do that habitually takes us away from being good as far as the alignment is concerned, soul self, or anything that takes us away from love and moves us towards fear, and those two are opposites. If we move away from love of God, we lose faith and we develop fear. So anything that moves us out of this way of being towards this habitual, negative, fearful way of being, anything like that, we have to look at it. In other words, you have to face your fears. In other words, you have to give up your habits. Easily said, isn't it? More easily said than done. However, this is the devil card. And we're moving towards a very advanced level now within our tarot journey. To have come this far is quite an achievement. When we can face that within us, which is habitual and makes us afraid, then we've reached a very high level of soul consciousness, really. It takes quite a lot of courage, clarity, to face down the devil. Now, this is going to be an embodiment in someone or something in your life. A person that makes you frightened, a person that tempts you, a situation that draws you into a way of being which isn't really that about yourself which you love. It's something that you feel a little bit ashamed of, or that kind of thing. You know what's wrong. You know what you should not be doing. And I'm not talking about this should coming from some other finger wagger. I'm talking about your own conscience. You know what changes you from being clear of conscience to being bad, embarrassed, ashamed of yourself. You know what that is. And there's no way around it. You have to face it down. So if you're afraid of something, you have to walk towards it. And if you're habituated to something, you have to give it up. There's no easy way around those two things. It takes quite a lot of clarity and spiritual faith and courage. It's a real measure of your worth to yourself as a self. And this is the furthest that we go in our centrifugal journey. We get to the outermost limits of our distance from God when we come to terms with the devil within us. So whatever you're most afraid of, you've got to do that thing. In my case, I was really troubled deeply by claustrophobia. I remember hiding away in a cupboard because my mother wanted to force cod liver oil down my mouth. And I hated the idea, and I hid away in this very small space, really afraid of this horrible tasting stuff. And I guess that was the beginning of my claustrophobia. And I had a tremendous fear of heights as well, which I think is a much more natural fear. And so I buried myself under the earth to deal with my claustrophobia. And I jumped out of an aeroplane to deal with my fear of heights. That's the kind of thing that is non-ordinary, the kind of adventurous activity that only certain people want to do. And those were relatively straightforward. I knew what I was afraid of, and so I found the courage to do it. I think playing rugby was another example of that. Habits, however, they're much more difficult to deal with. And a guy I met with some wisdom, he just said, look, whatever I did yesterday, I'm not going to do it again today. And this applies to most of the things in his life, but mostly to do with pleasure. So by all means, have your pint of Guinness, but not today if you had it yesterday. Have a smoke now and again, but not 2 days in a row. And if you can extend that, like you do it now and again, but not all of the time, then you're dealing with your habits. And we come later in the tarot to discuss the importance of not throwing away all of your pleasures in order to become more spiritual. It's not more spiritual. It's more self-disciplined, but it's not more spiritual. The world and its sensuality deals with an aspect of ourselves where sensuality is seen as a sacred, spiritual principle. We have these senses, and they give us this sense of intense joy and a sense of beauty, which the denial of them does not give us. These things are sacred unless we make them into habits. When they become habitual, it's the devil's work. So when we can do these things, face our fear and give up our habits, then we move to a special level of spiritual awakening when we have both the angelic and the devilish within us. And if you look at humour now, you will notice that some humour is actually really not okay. Some humour is helpful. And it comes across in the terms of the tone and attitude of the humorist. If you go back in history, you will find the court's jester in the English ruling system, and it was throughout Europe. Now, the word jester possibly comes from Chishti, which is a Sufi order, and it is put forward the idea that these court's jester were Sufis. They were spiritual teachers next to the king. And they had this in the Middle East as well, where the same principle applied, where there was a satirist kept close to the Sultan who would limit the authority of the tyrant. In today's world, the satirist, humorist like John Cleese or Billy Connolly, these kind of people, they're taking the mickey out of the political forces of the time in a devilish way, in a humorist kind of way. The humour is devilish, humour is mischievous, and the purpose of it is to bring down overblown authority. And devilish energy does that. The authority figures of the world require us not to do things. And if you're rebellious, you're going to do them just because you're told not to. Well, this is devilish energy. And within yourself, if you actually are so pious that you only ever do spiritual practice and you never give in to your pleasures, then that piety becomes pomposity. And eventually that becomes the kind of energy that the Pope actually had, which was the energy of a tyrant. So we're in danger when we do spiritual practice of becoming governed by the tyranny of what we say is goodness. And the devilish energy is an antidote to that. So if we give up everything which gives us pleasure and is naughty, then we cannot moderate the power of the tyrant. And the tyrant that we're talking about is not an external figure, it's the internal figure of self. If you live a rigid life because you don't want to do bad things, then that's life denying. That's kind of worse than the doing of the bad things. Now, another, shall we call it a justification or explanation of what the devil energy offers us within the wisdom of the tarot, is that it brings us the opportunity to further our development of light. Light cannot exist, it's meaningless, without shadow, without darkness. They don't exist unless they coexist. So if we want to develop that feeling of light, and we do, then we need shadow. We need not only to demonstrate our light, but we need to develop our light in order to recognize it and to have it grow. So we need there to be devilish energy in order that we can both accommodate some of it by the principle of resonance and then demonstrate our preference for light over the shadow. Those two things are different things. Resonating with the dark energies means that we have occasionally to indulge our pleasures and maybe even our fears, so that we actually understand what it is to have them. If we did not have that understanding, well, we couldn't understand anyone's problems in life, which would make us very lacking in compassion. But that's not the principle here. The principle is that we can't actually influence anyone with our light unless we resonate with their shadow, if we see it in terms of a healing or a teaching role. But if we see it in terms of a self-development role, we will not grow unless we grow our light. And we will not grow our light unless we, to some extent, indulge in shadow. Very controversial teaching, of course. However, you will find in your life experiences, when you look back on your life and you think about what you experienced, you take the shadow part of that out and there's nothing. Your life experiences are what they are because of the fact that you brushed up against the devil at some point and you came out on top. That's the thing that we have to do, and we have to know that we will always do that. Whenever we interact with the devil, whenever we resonate with pleasure and fear and those kind of things, we will always eventually come out on top. But the journey that you take between entering that interaction and overcoming the temptations, that journey, you could call that purgatory if you like. That's when you don't feel particularly aligned with the soul, when you feel embarrassed or anxious or nervous or lacking in certainty of self, when you feel those things that you don't like feeling, that's when you're doing this dance with the devil. And the way out is to overcome, to face your fears and to give up your habits. That's life. We're not going to escape it. And we don't want to, because it's why we came, to have this dance with the devil and to come out on top. And you try dancing without a certain amount of devilishness within you, it's boring. It's not a dance.